Hello there. So in today's video, we'll be talking about the axial skeleton in general, but in more particularly, we'll be talking about the skull in the axial skeleton. So we know that the axial skeleton consists of the trunk and the skull, and also we know that the appendicular skeleton consists of the upper limbs and the lower limbs. So in today, we'll only be talking about skull. So let's get started. So I actually love the skull the most because I find it particularly interesting because the bones in there are very compact. They're very tied up into a very small area, small space, to make this beautiful piece of bone in here as a whole. So in today's video, we'll see how far we can go. How you study the skull. First of all, there are different bones, individual bones that you need to know the names of. Also, there's the skull as a whole, because when you look at the skull, the bones are not individually, they're not alone. You're not only going to see this bone, for example, by itself, or this bone. No, you're going to see the skull as a whole, and you're going to look at it from the front, from up, from down. So that's what the skull as a whole is. Next up, we're going to be talking about something called the paranasal synesis, and I'll be explaining what that is when we get there, because it's a little bit complicated. Lastly, we'll be talking about the joints of the skull, which happens to be much easier than the skull as a whole and the synesis. So very simple stuff. So let's get started. The bones of the skull. So the bones of the skull are actually divided into two parts. We have the cranial bones and the facial bones. The facial bones are the bones here that are like near the face, so that's why they're called the facial bones. And the cranial bones are the bones that protect the skull, basically. So the cranial bones, there are actually 8 different cranial bones. We have 2 temporal bones. Here's one on the other side. We have 1 occipital bone in the back here. We have 1 parietal bone. We have 2 parietal bones, sorry. We have 1 here, 1 on the other side. We have 1 frontal bone, 1 sphenoid bone on the inside, and 1 ethmoid bone. So we'll be covering them individually now, one by one. So let's get started. Number 1 is the frontal bone. Frontal bone doesn't have anything interesting to talk about, just this bone here. It has the supraorbital notch, this hole in here that is supraorbital, means above the orbit. Here's the orbit, supraorbital. And we also have the orbital surface of the orbital part, so we have this orbital surface in here, which means it is in the orbit. So if you look at a picture of the orbit's circle, and here's the eye, you're going to see the frontal bone contribute by this part in here. Next bone we'll be talking about is the parietal bone. So we have 2 parietal bones. We have 1 here and 1 on the other side. And this bone is the most boring bone in the body. It's so simple, just a piece of bone. And there's another one on the other side. That's it. Next up, we have the sphenoid bone. So actually, sphenoid bone is very interesting because it's called the butterfly bone. And the butterfly bone, or the sphenoid bone, is actually, here's where it is. It's, if you look at the bottom of the skull, if you look at it from the inside, you're gonna see the sphenoid bone here looking like a butterfly, and it has a greater wing and it has a lesser wing. So this is a lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, and this is a greater wing of the sphenoid bone. Very interesting stuff. And yeah, that's how it looks. That's where it is. Nothing else to talk about in particular. Just need to know where it is. If you need to look at the skull from the example from the side or from the front or from down or from wherever, you need to locate the sphenoid bone. Next up, we have the temporal bone. Actually, for some reason, temporal is one of my favorite names. So a part of your face that is like when you buy glasses, a part of the glasses where mostly the design of the glasses is in the temple. They call it the temple of the glass. So the temple why is it called that? Because this bone is called temporal bone, and this part of your face basically is called the temple of your face. So that's why it's temporal bone, and it has this hole here, the external acoustic meatus, or inside we have the internal auditory meatus. It's basically where your ears are. So that's where the whole of the sounds, I guess, or whatever, goes inside in here. So that's very interesting to look at. Here's a view of it if you're looking from the outside, and here's another view if you're looking from the inside. And it also has this process in here called the zygomatic process. And why is it called zygomatic process? Because there's another bone here called the zygomatic bone, but we'll be talking about that bone in a bit, so I will not talk about it much. Another process that is very, very important is this process in here called the styloid process. Why is it important? It's important because there's a ligament in here that helps assist in the joint of the mandible bone. So this is why it's very important. There's another process here called the mastoid process. I actually don't know why that is there. There must be a reason. I'm not very familiar with that. All right, next up we have the occipital bone. I love the occipital bone as well. Why? Because it's very straightforward. It's just a bone at the back of your head. When you sleep on the pillow, it's that bone that touches that pillow. And why is it particularly interesting? It's interesting because it is that bone where the skull lies on top of the backbone. So basically, it's that bone that holds the skull, your head, into place with the rest of your body. So we've already covered this: the axis, the atlas, how the atlas goes on top of the axis, and we have here the dents, and we have the transverse ligament of atlas that keeps the dents in place. We've already talked about all of this, but how does the atlas carry the skull on top of the superior articular facets? How does that happen? Well, it touches the occipital condyle. So we have one occipital condyle, two occipital condyles that touch the here we have condyle that touch the superior articular facet, and that basically works as like a bottom and top kind of thing, as like a. It's very simple. It's very interesting. Just keep in mind that the vertebrae start here and keep going down. So this is where the vertebrae are. And of course we have the foramen magnum, very interesting, because this is where the spinal cord goes out of the skull from. It's a very big foramen called the foramen magnum. I guess magnum means big or superior. I'm not quite sure about that, so I'll not talk about it much. Alright, so that should be it for the occipital bone. Lastly, we have the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is very interesting. If you look at the the eye, the ethmoid bone just plays a very small role in it here, and it's actually full of holes that I'll be talking about. Those holes are called the synesis, but I'll be talking about it later. So it's this bone in here behind the nasal bone. So here we have the nasal bone. We'll be talking about that as well. It is behind it. So that should actually be it for all of the cranial bones. So the bones that protect the brain, the bones of the skull that keep the brain inside of them. Next up, we have the facial bones. So the bones in here, the bones of the face. So we have 14 facial bones. We have one vomer. It's that bone that separates your right side of your nose to the left side of your nose. We have two zygomatic bones. Remember when we talked about the temporal bone, we talked about the zygomatic process. Oh, here it is, zygomatic process. And here's the zygomatic bone. So that's why it's called the zygomatic process. We also have the platine bones. We have two platine bones, one here, one here. We have one mandible, this here, the jaw basically. We have two maxillas. Here's one maxilla, here's the other maxilla. It has an infraorbital notch. We'll be talking about all of this. We have the inferior nasal concha. Here's the inferior nasal concha. This is this basically assists in the filtering and heating of air process in the respiratory process. It's all related to the respiratory system. So when we talk about that, we'll be mentioning the nasal conchas. We also have the lacrimal bone. So we have one lacrimal bone here, another lacrimal bone. And lastly, we have two nasal bones. So the bones of the nose. We also know that the nose is actually cartilages. So our noses are not inside. We have our nose stick outside. So that's cartilages in here. But the end of the cartilages are bones called the nasal bones. So let's cover them one by one quickly. So first of all, we have the maxilla bone. So we have one maxilla here, and we have another maxilla on the other side. So 1, 2, and something to keep in mind. Here's the infraorbital foramen. So that hole under the orbit. We also have the floor of the orbit. So here's the eye, the orbit. The floor of it, the bottom of it, is actually part of the maxillary bone or maxilla. We also have the alveolar process, where the teeth here, this process in here, very interesting stuff. Another process that is very important to keep in mind, we have the zygomatic process. So we talked about the temporal bone having a zygomatic process. Maxillary bone also has a zygomatic process, this here, and the zygomatic process. Why zygomatic? Because we have zygomatic bone in here. Very simple. We also have the articulations with the frontal bone, or the frontal process, another name for it. And what that means is that it is related. So articulations means connection, joint. So it's related or joined to the frontal bone. That's why it's called that. So another very important part is the palatal process. And what that is, basically, it's the top of your mouth. So behind your tooth, if you touch with your tongue, the top of your mouth, you're basically touching the zygomatic bone, as well as if you're touching the top of your tooth, that's also zygomatic bone. Very interesting stuff. All right, next up we have I said zygomatic, I mean maxillary bone, maxilla. Sorry for that. All right, next up we have the lacrimal bone. Lacrimal bone is basically the back part of the nose. So here we have the nasal bone, here's the lacrimal bone. And in this picture, I'll be talking about it in the next video, but something to keep in mind. Lacrimal bone is this bone in here. Just that's all you need to know. That is, it contributes into the orbit, this bone in here. Next up, we have the zygomatic bone, so the bones of your cheek, basically. And just something very important about it, has a zygomatico-facial foramen. So it has two foramens. One of them is called the zygomato-facial foramen because it's in the face. And we have the zygomatico-orbital foramen near the orbit. It's inside the orbit, inside the eye. That's why it's called this. We also have the temporal process. Why temporal? Because it touches the temporal bone. We have the... where is it? Here, temporal process. Yeah, temporal process. We also have the frontal process where it touches the frontal bone, and here this should be the maxillary process because it touches the maxillary bone. So this should be the maxillary process. I don't know why it's not labeled actually. Yeah, that's it. Zygomatic bone, very interesting. I love it. Next up, we have the vomer bone. So it's a very simple bone. It's just this bone that divides the right side of your nose to the left side of your nose. You have two sides on your nose, 1, 2. So that's the bone that divides them. Here, 1, 2, and that's the bone. When you're looking at it between different bones, it seems a little bit more complicated, but it's as simple as what it seems in here. Boink. Boink. That's it. Next up, we have the hyoid bone. So the hyoid bone is that this extra piece of bone here that is actually not in the skull, not in the face, but it's a bone. That's why we need to cover it. And this bone will play a huge role when we're talking about the respiratory system, but I'll be mentioning it later. For now, all you need to know is that it has a body, has a lesser horn, and a greater horn. That's all you need to know. So next up, we have the platine bone. Platine bone is that bone in here at the back of your mouth. So the mouth, here's the mouth, here's the top of the mouth, at the back of the top of the mouth. And it has different wings, different parts that you need to be familiar with. It has the orbital process, the sphenoid process, perpendicular plate, different processes, different plates that you need to know. But it's as simple as knowing that it's the back of the top of the mouth, here, this part. All right, next up we have the nasal bone. Very simple, the most simple bone in the skull. Just two bones that are the top of the nose. That's it. Next up we have the inferior nasal concha. This, like I've mentioned, is very critical, very important to know because it plays a huge role in the respiratory process, in the process of breathing, because it filters the air, it warms the air with mucus and other stuff. So that's very important to keep in mind. Lastly, and I like to say lastly, like my professor likes to say lastly, we have the mandible bone. So the mandible bone is basically the bone where the lower tooth grow from, lie. It has this mental foramen or mandibular foramen. We have nothing else to keep in mind. Oh yeah, something to keep in mind is that it has a head, a neck, a ramus, and a body. And we have two. It's cut, so it's one huge piece of bone. And something very interesting about it is that this bone is the only bone that is not basically tied up to the skull. There's a joint in here that keeps it in place. That's pretty much it. All right, yeah, so that's pretty much it for the bones of the skull. In the next video, we'll be talking about the skull as a whole. So we'll just look at pictures of the skull and try to pick out bones. And we'll also mention the parenchymal sinuses, the holes that are inside of the bones that contain air. We'll mention that later. And lastly, we'll be talking about the joints of the skull. So that should be it for this video. I hope I can make the next video very soon. And yeah, thank you for listening. I hope that was helpful.